For the past couple weeks, folks, I have taken a barrage of insults and attacks from the conservative right blogger and Twitter sphere. And I want to take a moment today to address this issue head on. Now, also for the past couple of weeks, I've appeared on Sean Hannity's show to discuss the NAACP and a couple comments made by some of their leadership. So now let me be very, very clear. Reverend William Barber, who is the president of North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, called Tim Scott a ventriloquist dummy. And then a little bit farther down, some random senator, I can't think it's representative, state senator Allen Holmes or whatever his name is, he made a comment calling Clarence Thomas an Uncle Tom. While a couple times I have said, you know, going against anybody because of who they're married to is not only wrong, but it's bigoted and it's full of hate and it's racist right off the bat. Don't get me wrong. I think if there's anybody's wife that's fair game, it's Clarence Thomas' wife, because she also engages in public politics and public electioneering, which makes her fair game. Different than a wife that does not, right? Like I think, well, that's in here and there. Different than a wife that's not. But I want to address this Tim Scott controversy head on. And also, former Congressman Allen West wrote a blog about an appearance I had with him a couple weeks ago, and I want to address that as well. And I will lump these all together in one address. While Richard Fowler, me personally, would never call Tim Scott a ventriloquist dummy, what I will argue is I do believe that the relationship between Tim Scott and the conservative right interest groups is so tight. It's tighter than white on rice. Let's be very clear and very honest and very open about that, right? And I would argue that Tim Scott's voting record is subpar when it comes to women's rights, LGBTQ rights, civil rights, workers' rights, and the rights of students. Now, before I go in, because people are like, that's an unwarranted claim. That is incorrect. Let's look at Tim Scott's voting record, because that's what you got to find out. You got to go right to the proof. On March 3rd, 2009, he was then state representative, Tim Scott, voted in favor of a law requiring a voter issued ID to vote that could only come from the Department of Motor Vehicles, disenfranchising those who don't drive cars, those who don't drive, those who don't have driver's licenses. Let me particularly talk about the college part, because that is the part that upsets me the most. Now, like many other states, the state of South Carolina has a college system where there are public universities that are the trust of the state. They're run by the state. Those universities issue IDs. If they're run by the state, if the college is run by the state, the college is owned by the state, the ID is issued by the college, well, by golly, that would be a government-issued ID, now wouldn't it? But in Tim Scott's bill, he says that those IDs cannot be used or not eligible as an ID to identify a voter, meaning disenfranchising thousands upon thousands of college students from voting in the democratic process. Moving forward, in March 2011, Tim Scott co-sponsored H.R. 1135, the welfare reform bill, that would deny food stamps to a family whose income was lowered because one of the family members or one of the breadwinners decided they were going to go on strike, or they were going to go on a labor strike. So basically, what he is saying is, even though Tim Scott and all of his right-wing buddies parade it around and talk about how great and grand the Constitution might be, which also gives you the right to protest, the right to stand up for your rights. Not to mention the impact that labor movements and labor strikes have had on making for better working conditions here in this country. He would say that if you are somebody standing up for your American right, and because you're standing up for your rights, your family loses their ability to eat, you lose the ability to feed your kids, that's your problem, not mine. Moving forward. Also, in March 2011, Tim Scott voted that it collected by itself to fund sending kids to private and parochial schools. Now, herein lies the problem. If you are for states' rights and you are for the right of the states, you got to give the rights to the states. It's all about the states. You got to let the states control. Who is it from you, Tim Scott, who's from the state of South Carolina, to tell the District of Columbia residents what to do with their tax dollars? Not only did he tell them what to do with tax dollars, he also took money that would have went to the public school system. He sapped that money and used that to fund private institutions and private schools. Privatizing our education is not a civil right, because what it does is it picks winners and losers. Republicans all day, they talk about Solyndra. They talk about, oh, they want to pick winners and losers. But my friends, when you say your child gets a scholarship to go to a private play voucher and your child doesn't, that is what you call picking winners and losers. Not to mention the fact that those practices don't make our public school systems better. They make our public school systems worse, because they allow for these parochial schools to pick who they want. The cream of the crop will always rise to the top. You want a school system that's going to take the students at the least among us, the ones that don't have enough vocabulary words, and make them A+ students. And that means you have to invest in our teachers and you have to invest in our schools. And when you invest, I think education, just like the NAACP thinks, education is a civil right. I digress. In February 2013, then state U.S. Senator, where he currently sits, he voted against the bipartisan Violence Against Women's Act, which provides civil right protection to women who are being abused by their partners. So, I say all that to say now, before I go any further, I want to read to you the mission of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Their mission is the following: to ensure political, education, social, and economic equality for all people, and to eliminate race-based discrimination. Now, if you are a member of Congress or a state legislature, and you do everything in your power to not ensure political, educational, social, or economic equality, because you actually limit those in all the bills that you voted for, and you are almost in favor of race-based discrimination because you are limiting the access of African Americans to go to the polls, you are limiting the access of Hispanics to go to the polls, and on and on and on and on and on, then you shouldn't be mad that the NAACP doesn't support you. You shouldn't be mad that Reverend Willie Barber called you ventriloquist dummy. You really shouldn't. And this goes further. And I want to go further to this point, because the reason why we have this outrage, America, the reason why we have this outrage is all because Tim Scott happens to be a black guy. Because when the NAACP comes out and speaks out against John Boehner, or when the NAACP goes out and they speak against Louis Gohmert, or the NAACP goes out and speaks against Michelle Bachmann, who all have comparable voting records to Tim Scott, you don't see the right ring being so outraged. You don't see the woe is me, because they happen to be white. But because Representative Tim Scott happens to be a black man, all of a sudden, civil rights organizations and African Americans should blindly embrace him as the next big, great black hope. I'm sorry, folks. It just does not work like that. Because let me tell you, Oprah Winfrey said it best a couple years ago when campaigning for President Obama. She said this: I'm not voting for President Obama because he's black. I'm voting for President Obama because he is brilliant. I want a candidate that's going to stand for my issues and stand up for my people, whether they're black, white, yellow, purple, or Asian. And if you cannot stand up and vote for my issues, don't expect me to support you. Don't expect me to support you. Don't be outraged when I don't support you. We want candidates that stand up for civil rights, and not because they're black, not because they're Hispanic, because it's the right thing to do. Point blank, period.